I was part of George Mason's study abroad program in which we went to Cuba, and the topic of our visit was the island after the Castro, the Cuban U.S. relationship. When I left for Cuba, and I was thinking to work on Cuba, is Cuba failing? Because the impression that one gets that the communism has destroyed the country and the people are in really difficult situations. So Cuba is a failed country or a failed state. So if with that assumption, ask a question: if that is the case, then who is failing the Cuba? Is it the communist rule? Is the Castro family or the Communist Party which rules Cuba is failing them? Or is it the what Cubans call the economic blockade from the United States, the American sanctions? Is that the reason? So with those two questions, I went there, and before leaving for Havana, we were in Miami where we met the Cuban exiles because Miami has a huge Cuban exile community, people who have been living there for decades. So our interactions with them, they gave us their perspective because they were the ones who who once attempted to take over Cuba in 1961 with the help of US CIA, what they call it, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed. Hundreds of people were killed and many were arrested. And later on, in exchange of hard cash and some medicines, they were released. So after that, we went to Havana and we visited a lot of communities. We had interactions with the U.S. diplomats, the former Cuban diplomats, and the community projects, the art scene, and different privately owned restaurants, which were really new to a lot of people, even for us, because we thought everything is owned by the government. So we spoke to the restaurants owners and the small private businesses, bars, taxi drivers, and the community. We also visited clinics. We spoke to doctors, the challenges which they face. We also visited government-owned grocery stores where people get ration monthly, and how that system works. So the role of government and the Cuban economy and society, we also had a first-hand experience talking to those peoples. So coming to the Cuban and U.S. relations, those two relations have not really been good. In fact, the Fidel Castro, when he took over in 1959, 2 months after the took over in April, he visited the United States, and he did make an attempt to have good relations with the U.S., but U.S. President Eisenhower at that time refused to meet him. And Castro met with the vice president, Richard Nixon, and he, after talking to Castro, declared him a communist. And since then, the U.S. government started labeling and categorizing the Cuba as a communist government. The fact that Castro was not a communist. There was a communist party in Cuba, but he was not part of the Communist Party. The revolution, the people who overthrew the Batista's dictatorship were not part of Communist Party or were not in alliance with the global communist movement. Inspirations were there, ideas were there, but they were not an overthrow of a communist party per se, the way we know in Vietnam, in China, and other countries which were overtaken by the communist parties. Anyway, so after that, the other attempts for reconciliation have really been proven to be very short-lived. Like Jimmy Carter's attempt to even visit Cuba and have good relations did not last long. Lastly, Mr. Obama's effort to opened the Cuban embassy, U.S. embassy in Cuba, and he himself visited Cuba. In fact, when we there at the Ernest Hemingway's residence, we were told that Michelle Obama was also there. So all those efforts from the Democrats have proved very short-lived. On the other hand, if you talk to Cubans, they tell you that it is the American sanctions, like Trump imposed 234 sanctions on Cuban economy, on Cuban society, on the government. You cannot export, you cannot import, you cannot do business with the Cuban government. So they blame American sanctions, which has really crippled their economy, and the economy has really slowed down, and the pandemic has done a big blow to their economy. 62% Cuban economy has really shrinked, and the limit on Cuban Americans, how much they can send money to their families. And in Cuba, like I'm originally from Pakistan, I can send as much money I want to Pakistan, but Cubans, they cannot, because there are restrictions from the American government. So the Cuban economy, no doubt, is suffering. Their exports historically have been only 3-4 products like tobacco, like sugarcane, few medical, surgical instruments, and the some medicines. Big source for Cuban economy. In fact, more than 25% of the Cuban economy depends on tourism. And tourism has been barely affected. For example, when Obama opened up Cuba for Americans, there were 600,000 Americans who were going and visiting Cuba. Obviously, when you visit a different country, you spend a lot of money. So that creates economic activity. That has really slowed down in Cuba. But what I really loved about Cuba is the Cuba's culture, the Cuba's music. I mean, it seems like music and dance is in Cuban DNA. Everywhere, every restaurant, the place we went and hang out with the people, we were offered a very warm welcome with the music and good food and welcome drinks. So that the Cuban economy may not be thriving. Cuban culture is thriving. Cuban music is thriving. Cuban music, I mean, everybody knows since late 40s and onwards, Cuban orchestra and their very unique forms of music. They are very popular across the world. So that part was very important. In Cuba, I also saw poverty. I also saw misery. I did not see much hope in the eyes of people. They were people seeking help. As we took some, like a lot of my class fellows and friends took medicines, clothes, and other necessities to help our Cuban friends. But I don't think Cuban people deserved that destiny or that kind of life. It's such a beautiful country, small island. They can really prosper and grow if they have good relations with the United States. And they are willing. It is the United States government and the lobbies within the US who are not allowing this to happen. Thank you. Yo soy un hombre sincero.